Mush Morton was probably the most influential submarine skipper of World War II. He was really the first true submarine ace, and I compare him quite a bit with the pilot aces that did so much in World War II, in the air war, especially in Europe. Mush is such an interesting character that I'm surprised, and was surprised, that nobody had done a biography on him yet. I'd done several books on World War II submarines and history. I always joke and say I don't write about submarines and I don't write about World War II history. I prefer to write about people, and people in extraordinary situations, and extraordinary people in extraordinary situations. And that's exactly describes to a T Dudley Mush Morton, the fellow with the funny sounding nickname. He, I won't say single-handedly, because he had some peers at the time that were doing some very unusual things with those remarkable vessels when World War II broke out. But he was definitely the one who stood above all the rest in the way he innovated the use of the submarine in warfare. Prior to World War II, the submarine was, in most cases, a defensive weapon. It was designed to protect harbors and shoreline. They were called fleet boats, the submarines were, because they were designed to also accompany a fleet of other vessels and to be able to protect them from attack, the ability to submerge or go chase attackers. But in most cases, they weren't even fast enough to stay up with the fleet. They couldn't even do a real good job of that. At the same time, not only was the equipment limited, but the methods of fighting submarine warfare were completely different. The theory was that you stayed hidden. If you had a perfect shot, you took it because of the limited number of torpedoes you could carry. Once you fired that shot, you ducked and you ran as fast as you could, which wasn't very fast. About 8 or 9 knots was about the most they could do while submerged, only about 20 knots on the surface. So the stealth was the main thing. So submarine skippers were pretty much taught that's the way to conduct warfare. Well, the afternoon after Pearl Harbor, when President Roosevelt made that famous Day of Infamy speech, he immediately issued, for the first time in American history, the declaration that we were in unrestricted warfare with the Empire of Japan. Instantly, that changed the thought process of how we fought a war. Luckily, we had two things going for us. Even though we weren't totally convinced that there was going to be a war in the Pacific, we still had some far-thinking folks in the Navy who had begun development of a new class of submarine. One that could go farther, dive deeper, carry more torpedoes, and oddly enough, have more crew comfort. When you think of submarine warfare, a lot of people think of the German U-boats, and those were an extraordinarily effective fighting machine. But the new class of submarines that were on the drawing board in the 1930s were far superior even to the U-boat. The first was the Gato class. The Gato class, again, could dive deeper, go farther, had much more firepower than anything that had come along. The one thing we didn't have when the war broke out in December of 1941 was submarine skippers who could fight the kind of war that we needed to fight against the Japanese in the Pacific. It's not their fault. They had been taught a whole different way to run those submarines. But once that unrestricted warfare was declared, thankfully, we had some officers who stepped to the forefront and adapted those submarines and were able to take that remarkable equipment and use it very effectively when the war broke out. I like to joke and say most of them had matinee idol names: Creed Burlingame, Red Ramage, Moke Milliken. I mean, these were great names. It sounds like movie matinee sort of heroes. And then here comes Mush Morton, Dudley Mush Morton. Not only was he a character, but he instinctively knew how to take that new class of submarine and use it to its best effect in World War II. That's who Dudley was. Dudley, like a lot of submariners, was born far, far from salt water. He grew up, most of his young years were spent in Kentucky. His father was in the coal mining business. But his dad sent him down to Miami because he and his teenage son were his teenage brother were very rambunctious fellows in high school. And his mother was ill and was not able to handle those two teenage boys. So he went to live with his aunt and uncle in Miami. It's fortunate that the aunt and uncle were very well off and very politically connected. They were able to get Dudley into the Naval Academy after he spent some time in a prep school. He did not have an especially distinguished career at the Naval Academy. He was a good athlete. He was a world-class wrestler and also a football player, though wrestling was really where he excelled. But he tended to rub his instructors and commanding officers the wrong way because he thought on his own. He had a very active and creative mind. He didn't necessarily take his studies seriously. He much preferred to be in a little skiff out on the Chesapeake Bay. He loved to sail, and that means he was obviously cut out to be in the Navy, but not necessarily submarines. After he graduated, he actually went to the West Coast and was aboard a destroyer for a period of time, but eventually decided that he wanted to be a submarine captain. A lot of people chose submarine command for a number of reasons. One, typically the command of a vessel is the most rapid way to advance in the Navy and eventually become an admiral. A lot of people enjoy the smaller crew and being able to know each crew member and each crew member's capabilities without having 600 or 700 men to have to know. They typically know where their crew is from, who their parents are, how good they are when they have to dive or surface or fire torpedoes. So for that reason, a lot of people preferred submarine command. Of course, when he went into submarines, and most people in that era went into submarines in the early 30s, they did not know that they would necessarily be in the kind of war that they eventually would be in. Once he got into submarines, again, he did not have an especially colorful career. He was just a very typical submarine skipper in very old equipment, the old S-boats, which were not very effective. When the war broke out, he was actually the skipper of one of those old S-boats that had spent time in the Caribbean and helped protect the Canal Zone against any possible German activity if the war should break out. When the war did start, he was off the East Coast and had one encounter with a German U-boat. And he did fire one torpedo at that U-boat. He knew it was not going to hit anything because it's hard for one submarine to sink another submarine because you not only have this and this, but you also have this and this to have to think about. He did what most skippers would have done after he fired the torpedo. He dived and he went away. He was actually reprimanded for that by his commanding officer, who recommended that Morton be sent to some other branch of the Navy and not remain a submarine captain because he turned and ran from that U-boat. I don't know if Morton took that to heart or if it just made him mad, but I think from that point on, he wanted to prove that he had what it took to be a submarine skipper. He didn't get run out of submarine service at that time. He ended up actually in Pearl Harbor as a prospective commanding officer of a submarine. They gave him command of an old boat called the Dolphin. When he first walked on the boat, he announced to the crew, anybody listening, that this is a death trap. There is no way I'm going to take this thing to war. He went back to his squadron commander and refused to go out on that submarine because it was in such bad shape and so ill-equipped. Well, the submarine commander, the squadron commander, said, okay, you're finished with submarines. Told the yeoman to draw up the paperwork and get Morton to the surface Navy as quickly as he could. Morton went in to plead his case to the squadron commander's commander. He walks in, he shakes the man's hand. The man says, the commander says, you know, it seemed like I remember you at Annapolis. Weren't you a wrestler? Didn't I see you play football? Yep. They sat down, they talked about football and wrestling. The submarine division commander later said, any man with a handshake like that can command my submarines. So Morton once again dodged the bullet and went on into and stayed in the submarine Navy. I'll mention too, at a period of time when he was stationed on the West Coast, he was actually on the destroyer in the early 1930s in Los Angeles, San Pedro, California. He spent a lot of time with Hollywood folks. He loved to go to the Hollywood parties. They loved him because he was such a convivial individual. He told great stories, most of them not true, but he told great stories. And he was very, very popular in Hollywood when he was stationed there. And that's going to come back later on. After dodging that other big bullet and staying in submarines, Morton was assigned as prospective commanding officer on the USS Wahoo. The PCO, or Prospective Commanding Officer, means you take a ride on a patrol with an experienced submarine skipper, and you kind of learn the ropes from him, and then you come back and you get command of your own vessel. In this case, there was a lot of collusion among the crew on the Wahoo to get their current skipper replaced. And that collusion led to Mush Morton being assigned to the Wahoo as the PCO. He was actually aboard for Wahoo's second patrol. On the first patrol, the skipper at that time was very typical of the ones that were commanding submarines at the beginning of the war. He had fired some shots, but he, as they had been taught, dove and went away as quickly as he could. He didn't follow up to try to attack again. In the opinion of the executive officer, he had actually avoided contact with a lot of potential targets that were ripe for sinking. And he strongly suspected that the man was not cut out to be a submarine captain. That executive officer was a gentleman named Dick O'Kane. Dick O'Kane would eventually end up the most prolific submarine captain of World War II. He sank more ships than anybody else. He went to his squadron commander and recommended Mush Morton for the PCO cruise. And Morton was aboard. He observed the other captain. He saw what was going on, and he started politicking once they got to Australia at the end of the patrol to take over Wahoo. And that's what happened. I think it's important to note that the commissioning skipper on Wahoo, who took her on that first patrol and who rubbed the XO the wrong way and who was not very effective as a submarine commander, he went on to serve in the Surface Navy, did some heroic things, and helped to win the war. And that happened with a lot of those sub-skippers that just weren't cut out to be sub-skippers. And I think we owe them their due. They were just I like to say, they showed up for a gunfight with a knife. They just weren't prepared for that kind of war. Morton went on to lead Wahoo on her third patrol. That became the most spectacular World War II submarine patrol. They sank an entire convoy. They were due to be out for about 5 weeks. They were out of torpedoes in 3 weeks. Morton used the deck guns. Most submarine skippers didn't use the deck guns. They were primarily designed in the beginning, if you got caught on the surface and you had to fight your way out of a tight spot, you could use the guns on the deck. Morton would blaze right into a convoy with the deck guns going and shoot. They actually sank an entire convoy by themselves during that patrol. Well, when they got back to Pearl Harbor, the Navy knew we needed some good news. They made sure that the whole world knew about Wahoo. It was on the front page of all the newspapers, all the news magazines, newsreels and theaters everywhere. We're talking about Wahoo and its swashbuckling skipper, Mush Morton. Morton spent some time with the Hollywood folks and renewed some acquaintances there, and that'll come back a little later too. Second patrol was just about as spectacular. They did some amazing things. On that first patrol, they were ordered to pass a little island that had a harbor called Wahoo. They couldn't even find it on the charts that the Navy had issued. They had to use an atlas that one of the crew members had bought in Australia for his son, and they found Wahoo on there and were able to project it on the wall and draw in the right stuff so they knew that they were in the right area. The orders were to drive by and reconnoiter the area and see if there was any enemy activity there. Well, to Mush Morton, reconnoiter means sail right into that harbor, a harbor so shallow that they could actually feel the swells against the reef. They were close enough to the beach they could count the coconuts on the palm trees. They see a destroyer coming their way. Mush Morton executes the first successful down-the-throat shot. To shoot the narrow profile of a destroyer, it's almost impossible because there's only a narrow range where you can actually shoot. Otherwise, the torpedo won't arm, or it'll go too far and you'll miss it completely. Plus, it's a very narrow target. They sank this destroyer inside that harbor, and it's quite a dramatic scene. That just led to the lore. This all continued, but it's important to note that we were having a lot of problems with our torpedoes at that time. They simply wouldn't explode, they wouldn't run true. One of the higher ranking members of the submarine command was an ordnance engineer who had designed those torpedoes, so he was very reluctant to admit that there was any problem with them. Mush Morton was not reluctant to admit that there was a problem with them. He even went to Charles Lockwood, the commander, submarine specific, and pitched a fit in his office about the situation with the torpedoes. After that, he called his wife, Mush Morton did, and said, "You've married a failure. They're going to kick me out of the Navy." And he honestly felt at that point, even though Charles Lockwood was a big fan, and he was the most famous submarine skipper in the world, he was convinced they were going to run him out of the Navy because of all of his complaining about the torpedoes. Turns out that was the impetus, one of the things that pushed the Navy to go ahead and do something about the torpedoes. And they did get better after that. He ended up with a total of 5 patrols in only 10 months. He was one of the most prolific skippers in the Navy in sinking a large number of vessels despite the problems they were having. But Wahoo was lost on the last patrol with all hands. And until 2005, we weren't even sure where Wahoo was. We knew she was off the northern coast of Japan, off Hokkaido. But thanks to some of Mush Morton's relatives, thanks to the author Clive Cussler, and to the Navy, and even to Russia and some Russian petroleum exploration craft, they eventually located the wreck. They took enough pictures to convince the Navy that it really was Wahoo, and now they've had several memorial services there. It's a great relief to the family of the men who were lost to be able to point to a particular place and say that's where the submarine went down. To that point, Wahoo was still listed as missing in action. For all the family members knew, the crew could have been captured, they could have died in concentration camps, prisoners of war camp. They didn't know what happened. But the men who found Wahoo, who were able to do the research, actually talked to some of the pilots that fired on Wahoo that day when she was sunk. They pieced together the total story. Morton was fighting to the end, as was his nature. He was unable to dive deep enough to avoid bombs that the planes were dropping, and she sank there in, just off Hokkaido. It's also important to note that the people who were searching for established a memorial there, not to Wahoo only, but to Wahoo, to all the people who lost their lives at the hand of Wahoo, and they call it a peace memorial. This is to honor the people who fought on both sides and who died in action, not just the American submarine. And it's a beautiful memorial overlooking that stretch of water where Wahoo actually went down.
What prompted you to write this book?
I had written several books about World War II history, and was kind of moving away from that for a while, and had some other ideas for books I wanted to do. But I was in Jacksonville, Florida on business, and had several hours before my flight was scheduled to leave, so I ran up to St. Mary's, Georgia. In St. Mary's, there is one of the most wonderful submarine museums in the whole world. It's a tiny little place. But it has, you could build a submarine out of the stuff they have in there. If you go upstairs, they've got a lot of out-of-print books. Back before the internet, they had actually taken the trouble to type up and reproduce the patrol reports from every single World War II submarine patrol. They've got them there where you can just open the big books and read. Morton, by the way, when he wrote in those patrol reports, it was like poetry. The guy could have been a great novelist because he had a colorful way of writing, and I stole a lot of that in this book. But I was sitting there, and I pulled up a book about World War II skippers and how influential Morton and a few others had been in the way the war was conducted and how they were able to win the war. People don't realize that at no time in World War II was the submarine force any more than 2% of the total naval forces in the South Pacific. And yet submarines sank over 50% of the enemy shipping that was sunk in World War II. We lost 3,200 men. We lost 52 submarines in that war. Submariners also had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the service. We think about the Marines, who were those extremely brave men, and we think about the loss of life. Almost 25% of the submariners who went to war in the Pacific died in those submarines. But in thumbing through that and reading about Mush Morton, well, I've got to find his biography somewhere. I've got to find out more about this man because he's one of those fascinating characters that just I love to read about. I couldn't find anything. Dick O'Kane did a very good book called The Wake of the Wahoo, but it's more about Wahoo and her crew, and Mush Morton's an important part of it. The yeoman on the Wahoo, who was almost on that last patrol where they were lost, he literally was taken off the boat at the dock in Midway, and he watched Wahoo sail away. He wrote a very good book about the enlisted man's point of view, but it wasn't just Wahoo, it was other ships. And again, Mush Morton was an important part, but not a biography. I wanted to find out more about what made the man real, what made him the way he was. It's just a great story, and I'm a sucker for a great story.